Dunlop Kirk sits at the bottom of the main street in the picturesque village of Dunlop in Ayrshire. The site is originally that of a pre-Reformation chapel, but it was converted round about the time of the Reformation and subsequently extended, particularly during Victorian times. The church today receives many visitors each year, particularly to see our extensive collection of very fine stained glass windows. What many visitors miss, however, is that the grounds of the church contain two other very significant buildings, both with a Category A listing compared to that of B for the church and its stained glass. Looking down to the left here on the picture, we can see them. They're called the Clandeboyes School and a mausoleum called the Clandeboyes Tomb. Both of these structures were built in 1641, and we can see here the inscription above the doorway to the school building with its later extension, which replaced a wooden staircase giving access to an upper floor. The interior contains this inscription, which states that it was built by James the Viscount Clandeboyes in memory of his father Hans Hamilton, who had been the pastor in the church for some 45 years. This picture of the interior of the Clandeboyes School shows how originally it would have been a two-storey building, with the classrooms in the lower part and the upper part being the accommodation for the schoolmaster. Education was, of course, fundamental to the Presbyterian faith, and the Clandeboyes School at Dunlop was one of the first church schools in Scotland. At the rear of the school, James Viscount Clandeboye also built this splendid mausoleum to his parents. The interior of the tomb contains this monument to his father Hans Hamilton, who was minister at Dunlop from 1563 to 1608 and in fact was the first Protestant minister of the Dunlop Kirk, and to his mother Janet Denholm. Originally these figures were highly painted, and this earned it the nickname the Picture House in later times. So who was this James Hamilton, the eldest son of Hans and Janet, and how did he earn the title of Viscount Clandeboye? Hamilton was probably born in this building called Kirkland, which is located about 100 metres up along the main street from Dunlop Kirk. This building remained the manse until 1781, but it was the vicarage in the 16th century during the period before the Reformation, and indeed would have been the home of John Major, who was a well-known philosopher and religious thinker, very influential on the continent, and who became a principal at Glasgow University. He was indeed a teacher to John Knox during that period. Hamilton went on to study at St Andrews University and was noted for being a great scholar. For whatever reason, rumour has it shipwreck, he found himself in Dublin around about 1587, where he stayed and established a school. Very quickly thereafter, however, he established himself as an agent to King James VI. Elizabeth I is on the throne of England, Wales and Ireland at that particular stage, and has inherited a very troubled situation in that country. Ireland has been in some level of difficulties really since the early Middle Ages. The people of Ireland, not dissimilar to the Scots, are organised into a clan structure based on kinship rather than the feudal system. During one of these squabbles, however, the Normans are invited in to try to sort things out, and as a result, England gains a foothold into Ireland. This is in the 12th or 13th century. This troubled situation continues, with the English finding it very difficult to gain a foothold in Ireland. These Irish clans remained sovereign in the northern and western parts, and the English really only have a foothold in the east coast, in the area we can see here called the Pale, and to a lesser extent round about the Belfast Lough area, particularly at Carrickfergus Castle. From the period of the Reformation, things have gone steadily downhill, with the Irish retaining the Catholic faith, and indeed the early Norman settlers, the Old English as they were called, retaining the Catholic faith also. These groupings were against the power of England and also against the more recent settlers from England into Ireland. During the latter part of her reign, Elizabeth fought a long and difficult war with the clan chiefs, particularly a rising of the O'Neills and the O'Donnells from the north part, from the Ulster part of Ireland. And eventually these groups were defeated. Elizabeth attempted to be magnanimous and introduced a system of surrender and re-grant. What this in effect meant that if they surrendered their lands to the crown, they would be given them back, so long as they accepted loyalty to the crown. In effect, giving up the old kinship ties for those of the feudal system and recognition of the king, or the queen in this case, as being the sovereign. This uneasy situation continued until Elizabeth's death and the assumption of the crown of Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales by James VI of Scotland, who of course became James I of the whole of the United Kingdom. In the meantime, Hamilton had, however, extended his reach. Whilst Elizabeth was still on the throne, he'd been granted the position of a Scottish agent to her court, and also later became a fellow and the bursar of the newly established Trinity College. As a result of this, Hamilton found himself in a unique position, well trusted by the new King James and highly knowledgeable about the situation in Ireland. King James had inherited a very difficult situation with a highly Presbyterian population in Scotland, a strongly Episcopalian population in England, and in Ireland a population really to a large extent dominated by Roman Catholics and particularly by Ulster clan chiefs who were still highly resentful of the imposition of rule from England and indeed now Scotland. Now we have to introduce another very significant character, Hugh Montgomery, also from Ayrshire, and the Laird of Bradeston, which lies between Dunlop and Beath. Hugh was born in 1560. In his youth, he was something of a soldier of fortune, serving at the French court and then under the grandfather of William Orange in the fight against the Spanish in the Netherlands. He duly inherited the title of the 6th Laird of Bradeston, but during a quarrel with the Cunningham family was accused of the attempted murder and fled to the Hague. He duly managed to return to Scotland and was given something of a pardon by King James and established himself as an influential individual in the court. But he is primarily something of a soldier of fortune, unlike Hamilton, who is a scholar and a diplomat. Things remain troubled for the Irish clan chiefs. They begin to realise that surrender and re-grant isn't working. They don't particularly find it easy under the new feudal yoke. And indeed some of them find themselves increasingly at loggerheads with the throne of the new King James. Indeed, this culminates in 1607 in a large group of them deciding the best thing is to leave on a ship from Lough Swilly in Donegal and go to the King of Spain and to seek forces to come and to throw the Presbyterian and the Episcopalian traitors to the Roman Catholic faith, to throw them out of Ireland once and for all. This period becomes known as the Flight of the Earls. In fact, they don't receive help from Philip of Spain, and most die in poverty, living in the Vatican under the auspices of the Pope. Jumping back to 1604, Montgomery, always the opportunist, sees the chance to gain some land in Ulster. He does this, one of the chiefs, O'Neill, Con O'Neill, has fallen into a quarrel with the king's men and he's been thrown into prison. Montgomery strikes a deal that he will set him free in exchange for a share of his lands in that area round about Belfast and to the south into the Ards Peninsula, an area called Clandeboyes. Like many tales of old, there is a great deal of glamour in the plot to spring Con O'Neill. It involves the seduction of a jailer's daughter. It involves the hiding of a rope in a cheese, and these are used to spring O'Neill, and he's transported by ship to Largs and from there taken to Bradeston Castle between Dunlop and Beath. For whatever reason, as they attempt to strike a deal to gain O'Neill a pardon in exchange for his piece of land, Hamilton comes on the scene, and Hamilton, of course, is the key diplomat, and he, I suspect, is able to secure a pardon for Con O'Neill against him being allowed a third of the land. So as a result, Con O'Neill is pardoned, and he retains land round about Belfast, which he subsequently loses, and Hamilton and Montgomery each obtain substantial lands in that part to the south of Belfast known as the Ards Peninsula, amongst the most fertile lands in the northern part of Ireland. And here are the beginnings of the differences between Ulster and the rest of Ireland, and indeed many would argue the beginning of the troubles which have stretched right down to the present times, resolved to some extent by the Good Friday Agreement. The challenge facing both Hamilton and Montgomery is how to make best use of this land that they've acquired in the face of a very troublesome Irish population. They decide to do this by bringing the younger sons of the landowners and tenant farmers from Ayrshire and from parts of the west of Scotland. They want them to come to build new farms and churches and schools and to establish firmly the Presbyterian faith in Ireland, and in effect to drive out the small Catholic smallholders in that area and to drive them back into the hills. There had been earlier attempts at such settlements under Elizabeth, under one Thomas Smith, but these had failed because he had attempted to bring in English gentry and nobility, whereas Hamilton and Montgomery brought practical Scottish people with the Presbyterian ethic and with the ability to farm the land in Ulster. They quickly built harbours, established trade to Scotland, and churches, and above all, schools. I mentioned earlier the flight of the Earls in 1607. At that, there arose for James, King James, an opportunity to seize control in a better way of the whole of Ulster, and he saw the success that the projects of Hamilton and Montgomery had secured. One of James' courtiers, Sir John Davis, proposed that the flight of the Earls represented the act of traitors, and hence the land could be confiscated, and that they could pick up on the colonising efforts which had taken place under Sir Thomas Smith, and that really the Ulster could be handed over in bulk to settlers from England and from Scotland. This process became known as the Plantations of Ulster, and indeed became the model for what happened in America. But in Ulster, the scale was much larger, particularly as it included terms and conditions which would suppress and remove the native Irish Roman Catholic population so far as possible. Landowners were offered the opportunity to gain parts of Ulster so long as they met certain conditions. These became known as undertakers because they undertook to meet these conditions. Building of schools, building of ports, building of fortified towns to protect against the native Irish, and particularly not to involve the native Irish, if at all possible, in the farming of the land. And so the plantation of Ulster was well underway, with the building of market towns and schools and churches. The Presbyterian faith ruled supreme, and the Roman Catholics were increasingly put down. Further settlement was sought, including those of merchant companies, like the Merchants of London, who took over the city of Derry and renamed it Londonderry. However, the estimates of land size and the availability of labour from Scotland proved problematic, and it became necessary to sublet pieces of land to the native Irish, but they remained an oppressed minority. That situation seeded the problems and the roots of what much later became the Troubles in Ireland. Hamilton continued to build up his estates and built himself a very fine house on the site of the former Bangor Castle. King James and the Presbyterian settlers in Ireland managed to keep the situation well under control until James' death. However, his son Charles proved much less adept, and inevitably a revolt occurred in 1641, which resulted in massacres of many of the Ulster settlers, and indeed larger numbers withdrew back to Ayrshire. This began a pattern of reconquest, first of all by a Covenanting army under General Sir Robert Monroe, and later on by the reign of Oliver Cromwell in Ireland, with many atrocities on both sides. But it established the roots of a strong Ulster Presbyterian culture, a culture loyal to the throne, but also was the roots of a nationalist culture which looked towards a united Ireland capable of determining its own future. James Hamilton, Viscount Clandeboyes, is very much seen to be the father and the founding figure of the Presbyterian culture, which to this day prevails a lot of thinking in Ulster. In order to promote an understanding of Ulster Scots culture and values, an Ulster Scots agency has recently been established, and for them Dunlop Kirk and the Hans Hamilton Tomb and School are very much a place of pilgrimage, and they've placed this board at the entrance to our church at Dunlop. Hamilton returned to Scotland in 1641 and built the Clandeboyes School, which we saw at the beginning, and also the tomb to his parents. He died shortly thereafter and is buried in Bangor Abbey. Movement between Dunlop and other parts of Ayrshire and Ulster continued well into the end of that century and into the next. And there's another site that's worth visiting when you come to Dunlop, and that's the grave of Barbara Gilmer. The gravestone is just as one goes from the church gates down towards the Clandeboyes tomb. Barbara Gilmer is supposed to be the person who brought the making of hard cheese, common in Ireland but not known in Scotland at that time. She brought the making of hard cheese to Dunlop, and of course Dunlop cheese is now famous worldwide. With continued difficulties over freedom of religion in Ireland, things continued for some time, and with the opening up of travel to America in the 17th century and 18th century, then large numbers of people left Ulster for the opportunities afforded in the New World, many of them settling in Virginia and then North Carolina. These individuals went on to establish more of the Scottish culture and the Ulster Scots culture in their folk music, which can be heard to this day in many parts of the Southern Appalachians. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about James Hamilton, Viscount Clandeboyes, and part of the history of Ulster. And we do hope you'll visit us in Dunlop Church and see the tomb and the school for yourself.